Welcome to Biblocus, where the Bible intersects with your life. I'm Timothy,
And I'm Caleb.
and you're listening to Bible Discussions, the forum where we discuss biblical topics that are relevant to your life. So today we're continuing our series entitled, Who is Jesus Christ and Why Do I Need Him? In this series, we're going through the Old Testament books, and we're going one by one, and in each book we look for the attribute of God that jumps off the page at us, that characteristic of God that seems to be the purpose of the book. And we fully investigate that idea in looking just at the Old Testament, and we understand what did God mean when he was putting this book together. What was he trying to tell us about himself? So then we move on to the New Testament, and we see, well, how does Jesus Christ, who's the perfect image of God, how does he also exemplify the same attribute? So that's what our series is. And last episode, we talked about the book of Exodus, and we titled that The God of Salvation. And we talked about how God always saves first and then calls to obedience second. This week, we're going to look at the book of Leviticus, and we're going to talk about the God of Atonement. And in the New Testament context, we're going to talk about Jesus as our high priest. So, Caleb, I know when we do this series, we skip around a lot of stuff because we're just looking at one particular attribute of God and how it's exemplified there in the book. But last episode, we got the Israelites all the way to Mount Sinai, and we got them into that covenant relationship with God that God was calling them to after he had already saved them. And so now we're getting to the book of Leviticus, but there's been some stuff that's happened in between. So why don't you're the historian, so why don't you give us an update on how the people got to the beginning of the book of Leviticus?
All right. So the people of Israel agreed to enter into a covenant with God, but they left Moses himself to meet with God. While he was meeting with God, of course, the Israelites left to their own devices lasted about as long as a toddler does if you leave them alone with candy. And they took all the gold that the Egyptians had given them when they fled Egypt, and they melted it down and made a golden calf. And then Aaron, the high priest of God, Most High, told them that was their God who rescued them, and they bowed down and worshipped it. And then Moses came down, broke the stone tablets, and had to go up and get some new ones.
and probably some new rules related to the people's new behavior.
Well, not that new, maybe.
Yeah, well, it really doesn't matter what the rule is, right? Because it's sort of human nature that we're going to break a rule. I mean, in the garden, the trouble with being in covenant with God, and the people found out immediately, is that there are rules, and there's two sides to the relationship, and you have to honor your side of it. And we're really bad at that. And when we were in the garden, there was like one rule. You could frolic around to your heart's desire in in the case of Adam, with a naked woman, and but there was one rule: then don't eat this fruit off of this tree, and we couldn't keep that rule.
Yeah.
So here the people are in a covenant with God, and they're having trouble keeping rules again. So what happens now?
Well, God issues rules for the new covenant, including instructions for building the tabernacle, a place of worship and of God's dwelling amongst his people. He issues instructions for the priests, the order of the priests, and for the types of garments that the priests are going to wear, specific sacred garments for their roles, and all types of things that are going to go in the tabernacle, lampstands and the altar and basins and utensils, the ark, a lot of accoutrement.
Yeah, I kind of find it surprising. I mean, if you look at the flow of the Bible, that suddenly you have all of this cultic equipment and priestly instructions, because up until this point in the Bible, reading through the Pentateuch, there's not really a whole lot of discussion of priests, and only 3 priests have been named by name in the Bible so far, and it's Melchizedek, who's the priest of God Most High, that Abraham runs into and gives him a tithe after a great battle that he had. And then there's Potipharah, the priest of On, who Joseph is married to the daughter of Potipharah. And then there's Jethro, the priest of Midian, who is Moses' father-in-law. And so there's just those three named priests.
That name always sounds so out of place to me. Jethro.
Jethro, yeah.
Sounds like, some
Dukes
guy
of
out,
Hazzard.
out in the woods with a straw between the only two teeth that he has.
So then on top of that, besides the issue with the priests that surprises me is offerings and sacrifices. They aren't like that heavily dealt with earlier in the Bible. Like Cain and Abel, of course, you have one of them, their offering was accepted, the other wasn't. You have Noah, who, when he comes safely off the ark, he makes sacrifices to God. You have Abraham, who sacrifices to God on a few occasions, and same with Jacob. And then you have Jethro, the aforementioned priest of Midian, who had just come to visit his son-in-law at right before they got to Mount Sinai, and he sacrifices and shares a feast with Moses and the people. So, but now we get to Leviticus, and suddenly there's this elaborate cultic system, and so kind of what is God up to? Do you think at this point?
Well, as far as the priestly system, at Mount Sinai, the Israelites were afraid of God. If you read that part of Exodus, you'll see the mountain surrounded with thunder, and it's very awesome in the old sense of the word. So the Israelites are afraid of God. They ask Moses to mediate for them. They recognize their unworthiness, and so they specifically ask for someone kind of to be a go-between, because they feel afraid of approaching God.
Well, let's go ahead and read that for everybody. I can read it for us. It's Exodus 20:18 through 21. And says, when the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, speak to us yourself and we will listen, but do not have God speak to us or we will die. Moses said to the people, do not be afraid. God has come to test you so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning. The people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. So, anything strike you in there?
Yeah, they expressed their fear of God, and Moses tells them not to be afraid. Offers them some, comfort that God has specifically come to be with them. That God wants to be with us.
Yeah, and he also says, well, that this fear will actually be useful for you because it'll keep you from sinning. Well, that's debatable based on what we were just talking about with the golden calf, but I'm sure though it would be, and of course it is for all of us to contemplate the greatness and the highness of God when we contemplate our own actions, and even to try to strive to be more like God, to see him as the highest thing you could aspire to, but also to know that he does have rules, and it would be foolish for us to subvert those rules with our own wants and desires. So,
yeah.
So that makes sense. What you're saying and why the priesthood developed, because the people were fearful. They wanted mediation. They wanted somebody to give them a buffer between them and God. And so he says, okay, I'll give you Moses and I'll give you the priests, and they will come closer to me than you in proximity.
Yeah.
Because it would be a fearful thing. I mean, because we don't probably properly imagine what this pillar of fire and pillar of smoke that God appeared to them in, and what this shaking mountain, maybe most closely resembling like a volcano, and the fear that the people would have had. And so Moses and the priests are actually going to put themselves at risk. And we see that in the Bible.
Yeah.
There are occasions where that happens, that bad things happen, people in close proximity who don't listen.
Mm.
Um, so that makes sense to me, but what about this giant tabernacle?
Well, the point of the tabernacle, one, as Moses just said, was a place for God to come and be with His people. But the second point is that, as you just pointed out, even with the rules and even among the priests and people who should have known best of anyone, um, the rules would still be broken. I mean, like we talked about with the golden calf and with the fruit in the garden, we just don't seem to have any patience at all. And almost the first opportunity we get, we fall short. So the covenant wasn't going to last long because remember, a covenant is a two-way street. It's a relationship. God's already done His part by saving us, like we talked about in Exodus. He saves first and calls second. So the Israelites were not going to keep up their end of the covenant. I mean, the next time Moses goes to talk with God, they're going to, they're going to see if they can get away with a silver calf or something. So they needed a way to recover from mistakes and keep the covenant intact.
So, okay, so God gives them instructions to build this elaborate tabernacle, like we talked about. It's got a couple of altars, it's got tables and basins and utensils and such. And so God, he gives them all of this equipment, all of this cultic gear to use, and you would have to have a really good reason. You're already wandering in a desert for 40 years, right? And now you're going to carry around this giant tabernacle, and all of the gear, all of the altars, all of the priestly garments, all that stuff's got to be packed up and carried around with you while you travel. It's kind of a daunting
It's a
thought.
good thing they've got, the manna being provided for them. They don't also have to carry food.
Yeah. Yeah. So the Levites, of course, get the task of carrying all this stuff around. And so, but they get, as we'll see later, they get food also from the sacrifices and such.
Mhm.
But that's where the book of Leviticus comes in. Why would you need this giant building? Why make people carry this stuff around? And it's because of what it's used for. And that's where the book of Leviticus begins to give us the details of what happens in that tabernacle. And so there's detailed instructions for sacrifices, for the activities of the priests, for the annual feasts. There's dietary laws and infectious skin disease rules that the priests have to teach the people and educate the people on when they have various skin infections and so on. So there's all this information, all these things that happen when you go to see the priest for. And that is why we have this big building to carry around. But the book of Leviticus gives us a very, very good reason to carry it around. And we're going to get into that here in just a minute when we talk about atonement. So, I just, one more history lesson though, like what happened to the tabernacle? I mean, where is it now? And
Well, sorry. Technically, we don't know. It kind of fades out of history. They carry it into the promised land and keep the ark with them as they conquer the promised land. And in the time of King Saul, the ark is captured by the Philistines, and it's given back. Maybe we'll get to talk about that story later, but
yes,
it's a pretty interesting one. And by the time after Saul's King David, David brings the ark to Jerusalem, and then Solomon builds the temple for the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, the tabernacle just drops out of mention.
Yeah,
it's replaced by the temple.
And it had been in Shiloh, I believe, and so it may have just remained there after the temple was built. I don't know. So the interesting thing is that we don't have a tabernacle anymore. We don't even have the temple anymore. As far as the world does not have the temple anymore, the Israelites don't have it. And so it seems kind of weird when we talk about all the ritual that happens in the tabernacle or consequently in the temple later. When we don't have any of those buildings, we've never practiced animal sacrifice and all the things that are discussed. Leviticus becomes, instead of an instructive book for many people, it just becomes the place where the annual Bible reading effort ends.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
what's going on?
That's definitely happened to me more than once.
So, what we want to do in this lesson is recapture the powerful value of the book of Leviticus, and hopefully it will really inspire a lot of you when we get into the reason for the book and the value that it brings, that it has brought to mankind, and will hopefully flesh that out really well for you. And that's my big surprise for the day, is that I think that the sacrificial system in Leviticus is the genius of God in the Old Testament. That it's really the pinnacle for me. Um, the book of Leviticus is the high point of the Old Testament, and in fact, I think it's the genius behind the entire Judeo-Christian worldview. I think that this principle of atonement is the reason why um, the Western civilization even has gone farther than any other civilization in the past, and it's because of what atonement does for us. And so, what is so important about the sacrificial system? It is that it allows us to stop dwelling on our sins and move forward.
Mm.
And it doesn't matter whether you're wandering around in the desert, right? And you build a golden calf and you screw up, or whatever it is you do. You need a way to get that behind you and move forward. And so in Leviticus, we see these offerings. There's 5 of them, right? You have a burnt offering, a guilt offering, a sin offering, a grain offering, and the fellowship or Thanksgiving offering. And so those 5 different offerings that are there, and they allow us to make atonement and move forward. And so let's like look at an example. So in Leviticus 1:3-5, it talks about the burnt offering. It says, if the offering is a burnt offering from the herd, you are to offer a male without defect. You must present it at the entrance of the tent of meeting, so that it will be acceptable to the Lord. You are to lay your hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it will be accepted on your behalf to make atonement for you. You are to slaughter the young bull before the Lord, and then Aaron's sons, the priests, shall bring the blood and splash it against the sides of the altar at the entrance to the tent of meeting. So there's so many interesting things about this. I can let you go ahead and start if you like. What's the thing that you
Yeah.
find most interesting in there?
So first thing is the animal has to be without defect, unblemished, no spots or deformities. It has to be like a perfect specimen.
So why is that important, do you think?
Uh, I think we'll see more about that when we get to the New Testament as well. But in the Old Testament setting, it's because you're not giving God second best. I mean, if we look at the story of Cain and Abel, which is one of the few examples of sacrifices before Leviticus, it's not given entirely clear what the issue was, but God wasn't happy with Cain's sacrifice, and one possible reading of that is that Abel gave the best or the first of his fruits, and Cain held something back, or gave something of lesser quality, possibly.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think also too with this idea of atonement, and you're trying to make things right for the terrible thing that you did. You say, well, I happen to have this
Yeah,
calf out here that I don't think is going to do very well, so I'm just going to bring it over here, and
yeah,
then I'll get off easy this time.
yeah,
It's sort of like, well, you're not bringing anything to the table, and so yeah, the idea is bring your best, like Caleb said. So, so then,
if it's David will talk about. We'll see later. That what God really desires more than the burnt offerings is a humble heart and a repentant heart, and but the physical actions are going to be driven by the spiritual or emotional realities. So, the repentant person is not going to come to God, oh, here's, the cow that was going to die anyway. So,
Yeah, yeah. So, and then the second thing that I think significant is you've got to bring it to the entrance to the tent of meeting at the tabernacle. And I think that is a key thing because we already saw that the people were afraid to be in the presence of God.
mm,
And I think what God is signifying to them through requiring this of them is like, look, don't be afraid to come to me and be honest. Come to me, bear your sin, tell me about it, and we'll take care of it. And then we don't have to talk about it anymore, you know?
yeah.
And I think it's like,
And for you to be the one to do it yourself.
yes,
No
well,
mail-in sacrifices.
yeah, yes, that's right. And you mentioned David, and I mean, God said David's a man after his own heart. Well, that wasn't because of the terrible things that David did, which
Yeah.
he did several. It
I
was
mean, it's hard to get lower than, sleeping with your loyal soldier's wife and then killing him to cover it up.
yeah,
It's
yes,
like, what could you possibly do worse than that?
yeah. It's low. It's a low place. But you have to be honest with God, and you have to trust Him. And so I think this is about trust. It's about faith. It's about belief that God's on your side.
Mhm.
Okay, so and then you mentioned that you have to bring it yourself because that gets into this next thing I wanted to talk about is you have to lay your
Mm.
hand on the head of the animal while it's slaughtered.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, most of us that don't live on a farm don't butcher our own animals. We just go
Never
to the
even,
grocery store and get a
never even see
tasty.
it.
Yeah, we don't see it with the blood's already gone. It's packaged up, it's wrapped up, and it looks great in the counter there.
Nice and
Ooh,
clean.
let's get some tasty steaks and some potatoes.
Yeah.
Um, but imagine, for your sin, because of your sin, laying your hand on the head of an animal and it being sacrificed in your place.
And for a lot of people, this would have been their own animal too.
Yeah,
Some
yeah,
people might
that's
have purchased
that's
or
right.
traded for one, but
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, this might be something that you raised yourself, and you're having to, put your hand on it and watch it be slaughtered on your behalf.
Well, that's an excellent point because they were herdsmen, right? That's what they did in Egypt, in
Mhm.
addition to building, buildings with bricks. But they were in Goshen where they were herdsmen, and they were herdsmen now, and in where we are in the Bible, and so you're giving up your livelihood. Yeah,
Yeah.
you're taking food off your table, right, to do this
Mhm.
transaction. So, but not only that, but you're putting your hand on the head, and the animal's dying, its blood is being given up, and it's a very stark, in your face, symbolism of your sin causes death,
Mm.
and we are, I think, a little bit uh, isolated from that little mamby pamby, today. I think
Yeah.
that would just terrify very many people
I think
to
it's
face.
it's really easy today to downplay the seriousness of sin, but it would have been impossible to do that as an ancient Israelite.
Hmm.
Well, I mean, they're going to do it anyway, but there would have been more reminders, maybe.
So then, amazingly, right? And you jump in whenever you want to say something too. But amazingly, this animal is accepted as atonement for your sin, um, and so for the offerer, right? Because you're there, and so it's being accepted on your behalf, and uh, God accepts that as atonement for your sin.
Yeah, and the priests are there as in order they're the professionals, so to speak, to perform the sacrifice. Which that's another thing, you know. Just we're already removed from even seeing the slaughter. Imagine that being your job as a
Yes,
ancient Israelite priestess every day, just slaughtering cow after sheep after, every
and goats and rams and
just constantly.
grain offerings.
It talks about Aaron's sons have to throw the blood up against the altar. They have to make sure that it reaches the altar. And like, man, that would especially. I mean, that would have to keep you focused on what you're doing and why to
But
be walking in blood all the time.
Yeah. But I think it's a really good thing that you have this whole group of people whose whole purpose is to help you get sin out of your life.
Mhm.
It's like I think it would be very encouraging, honestly, because you see this whole. I mean, wherever you are in the camp, you see this tabernacle. You know what its purpose is. You see that an entire twelfth of your community is dedicated, to this,
Yeah,
and everything that goes on there.
it's one out of the 12 tribes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
of Israel, yes. And so you are encouraged by this to deal with your sin. So it's such a positive thing. I think the major point that you get out of this entire thing is that God wants to help us deal with our sins.
Mhm.
Because if he didn't, he could have just done away with all these people when the golden calf incident occurred. And he even offered to Moses, "Do you want me to start over with you?" I think he was, he did. But I think he was more helping Moses work through the issues of
Yeah.
the rebellion of the people. And Moses chose wisely to, you know, stick with these people, Lord. Let's help them. And God's like, yeah, I think you're right. Let's do that.
Yeah.
And so this whole system is put together. And so the whole idea is that God wants to help us deal with our sin because he doesn't want us to wallow in it, right?
Mhm.
He wants us to be able to move forward. And so, and then the overriding thing you get out of this is that God's on your side. He's on our side. And he wants to help us. And that was what the Israelites certainly would have learned from this entire uh, cultic apparatus and carrying it around. Why I carry it all around? Because it has such an amazing upside to it, which is my sins are going to be wiped out
Yeah.
and I can move forward.
And it really, would have helped with their psychology. Not that they would have thought of it that way,
Right.
but it
Yeah.
it helps you. I mean, it can still help us today with our psychology. I was thinking earlier when you were talking about the priests as this entire class of people, a 12th of the society who are focused on helping cleanse the people of their sin. I was thinking, what is there a modern equivalent to that? Obviously, that's part of what the church's role should be to point people towards Christ, towards the God who does that for them. But as we've seen religion kind of diminish in our society, and I thought maybe therapists. That's kind of what the average
Mhm.
person might do now is they go to a therapist to try to you know uh, shop vac their soul out, and I mean I don't know, that might be a whole other conversation, but I feel like there's been kind of there's a steady increase in um, mental health issues in the country, even as there's an increase in mental health treatment. So something's not lining up there
Well,
with our psychology.
yeah, and we have seen every episode so far how God helps us with our psychology. He helps us with our psychological health. He helps us with our sociological health as a people, as a community.
And with our problems.
Yeah, we saw in Genesis, right, that there's no dark, empty place you could get to
Yeah.
that he couldn't turn into something beautiful. And
Yeah.
so that's a hopeful, forward thinking thing, also.
Yeah. And in
And,
Exodus, he brought the people out of slavery. He
yeah,
saves us first and then calls it. He doesn't ask you to get your life right first, get your psychology right first. He just pulls you out of it and then calls you into the way that'll help you straighten things out.
yeah, it's kind of like a friend, who does something for you when, you're too ignorant to notice that you're screwing everything up, and they do that thing for you, and then later, you're thankful for it, and they're like, you know, I know it, but I just didn't want you to stay there.
Yeah.
So, all right, so that's kind of an explanation of the purpose of the sacrifices and the role of the priests. And so when you read Leviticus, don't read it as just like this, what in the world's going on with all these animal sacrifices? I don't ever do that. Think about it in the original context. And so, but that's not the end of the amazing thing that God is doing for the people in the book of Leviticus at all. What we've talked about so far is just the individual sacrifices, but or for individual people, or for priests. But in chapter 16, there's this talk of a high priest. And the chief role of the high priest, or originally for Aaron, who is the brother of Moses, who was in a sense the original high priest, but they didn't call him that at the time. It wasn't until the succession to his sons took place that they started calling it the high priest. But his chief role is to make atonement for the entire nation once a year on what they called the Day of Atonement. So in Leviticus 16, do you want to read this?
Yeah. Leviticus 16:29 through 34. This is to be a lasting ordinance for you. On the 10th day of the 7th month, you must deny yourselves and not do any work, whether native born or foreigner residing among you, because on this day atonement will be made for you to cleanse you. Then, before the Lord, you will be clean from all your sins. It is a day of Sabbath rest, and you must deny yourselves. I think it's interesting he said that twice. It is a lasting ordinance. The priest who is anointed and ordained to succeed his father as high priest is to make atonement. He is to put on the sacred linen garments and make atonement for the most holy place, for the tent of meeting and the altar, and for the priests and all the members of the community. This is to be a lasting ordinance for you. Atonement is to be made once a year for all the sins of the Israelites.
So the role of this high priest was just to cleanse the entire nation of all of its sin. And the details of what happened on this Day of Atonement then are detailed in the book of, or chapter 16 of the book of Leviticus. Also, we skipped past it to talk about this high priest because we wanted to understand who the high priest was and what his role was. And the actions that he did were earlier in the chapter. So I'll go back and read, for instance, how the Day of Atonement would have transpired. So it says in chapter 16, verses 3 through 5, this is how Aaron is to enter the most holy place. He must first bring a young bull for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. He is to put on the sacred linen tunic with linen undergarments next to his body. He is to tie the linen sash around him and put on the linen turban. These are sacred garments, so he must bathe himself with water before he puts them on. From the Israelite community, he is to take 2 male goats for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering.
I just, I went over this earlier, obviously, but for some reason, just now, it struck me that because the garments of the high priest are sacred, he's to bathe himself with water before he puts them on, and that made me think of, Jesus going to John the Baptist to be baptized, and John's freaking out, it's the other way around, and Jesus says, "No, we have to do this in order to, or how does he say it? To fulfill something, or that it's right and proper." But I feel like that has to be part of it. That he needs to be washed, or he wants to be washed because he needs to take on the role of
High priest.
I know I'm getting ahead into the
yeah.
New Testament there, but
Yeah, no, that's cool. Well, but what Caleb's talking about too is the first item of activity that has to take place is the priest himself needs to make himself holy so that he can serve in a holy capacity for all the people. And so if you didn't catch it in the reading, there are two different offerings taking place for both the priest and for all the people. Those are a sin offering and a burnt offering. And so Aaron is supposed to bring a bull for his sin offering and a ram for his burnt offering. And then the people are supposed to provide 2 male goats for the sin offering and a ram for the burnt offering. So there's 2 different groups of people, the high priest for him and his family, and then for the people as a whole, for the whole community.
yeah, that's 2 goats and a ram for everyone, not each person individually.
That's right, yeah. Just for the whole nation, there's just 2 goats for the sin offering and then 1 ram. Now, so did you want to talk about anything before I move on?
No, I think we're getting into it anyway.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Let's talk about this sin offering first, okay? Because that's what happens first is the sin offerings for both the priest and the people. So in Leviticus 16, 6 through 10, it says, Aaron is to offer the bull for his own sin offering to make atonement for himself and his household. Then he is to take the two goats and present them before the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting. He is to cast lots for the two goats, one lot for the Lord and the other for the scapegoat. Aaron shall bring the goat whose lot falls to the Lord and sacrifice it for a sin offering. But the goat chosen by Lot as the scapegoat shall be presented alive before the Lord to be used for making atonement by sending it into the wilderness as a scapegoat. And we'll have some more to say about the
yeah.
scapegoat in a minute. But the key here is that the sin offering is taking place here, and the request to be forgiven of sin on behalf of the priest himself first, and then of all the people.
That was interesting that I mean, it literally tells them to cast lots,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we might, the gut instinct reaction would be to think of that anything like, oh, casting lots, gambling. Definitely none of that in the Bible, but the high priest was supposed to do it.
Well, so this whole thing, it says at the beginning in verse 6 that this is to make a sin offering to make atonement. And so you're then in the last verse it says that the goat is making atonement for the people. And so this value of making atonement, it allows us to be of use to God, like in the case of Aaron or the high priest.
Mm.
He's able to, because he's holy, after he makes atonement, he's able to also make atonement for us before God. And so and it also allows us to be of use to others. So Aaron's doing both, right? The high priest is doing both. He's being of use to God, who wants to forgive us, as we saw earlier, and he's also being of use to his entire community.
Yeah. Then I want to point out that, obviously, um, Aaron he can't really make himself holy, right? Clearly, this is all being done in the context of God's covenant, right? So remember, God did the work of saving them before, and He's calling them to be His people, to be His holy people. And there's nothing in the blood of the goat any more than just intrinsically, any more than there is in the water of baptism intrinsically, right? I mean, these are things that God has ordained to be done for us in order to cleanse us, and it's not, uh, you know, it's ultimately God making Aaron, of use to him and to others.
Yeah, I think that's right because he wants to give us the opportunity to be able to get beyond our sin, whatever it is, whether that's individually or as a community, as we're seeing. And so, yes, it's odd to us, this whole animal sacrifice
Mhm.
thing, and how does that make you holy? But what it is, these people were herdsmen. They were slaughtering animals anyway. That's how they made their living. And so it would be the same as us, how we handle our money. Are we using our money the way God would want us to? Because,
Yeah.
we've gotten away from a barter society and we're all to a cash society.
Well, even beyond cash.
Yeah, now. But how do you handle wealth? Let's just say wealth,
How much Bitcoin are you giving to God?
Yeah. And so it doesn't seem as odd if you think about it that way, because this was their livelihood, what they did every day anyway. And so now they're doing it and giving some of it up to say, because God's giving them this opportunity. It's really an opportunity, and but it's expensive. I mean, it's very expensive. Imagine how long it takes to raise an animal and keep it healthy and make it, favorable to be used for a meal, and you could sell it to somebody, but instead you're giving it to God.
Yeah.
So he didn't make it cheap. This isn't cheap grace, right? It's like more like, the tough love that a parent has to have for a kid,
Mhm.
where you have to make it hurt and take something away from them until they they learn to do the right thing. But what's really neat about it is, I think, that the sins are removed. And, we're going to see some more of this with when we talk about the scapegoat here in a minute, but the sins are actually being transported away from you. And so this is a concept which is called expiation. There's a controversial, discussion about the word hilasmos in Greek and how it's used in the New Testament, whether it should be used as expiation or propitiation. And the idea behind those two things, expiation, is that the sins are actually wiped out, taken away, never happened, so God doesn't see them anymore. And then there's propitiation, which is to say that, well, you did these bad things, but because you've propitiated God, He's going to overlook them, because He's now pleased with you because of the sacrifice you made, and so He's going to overlook your sins, but your sins are still there. And I like thinking of it myself, especially in the context of Leviticus, and I think it carries over into the New Testament well, to think of it as this expiation concept, as not to get all dictionary on everybody, but I think that the concept is a good one to have in mind, that the sins are just wiped out and done away with, and now you can move forward because those sins are behind you.
Yeah. Yeah, you've talked to me about that difference before, where in the New Testament, I think there's a translation, a certain biblical translation, that just ignored the difference completely, because I think they say everlasting atonement or something.
Oh, well, that's the
Just
NIV.
to bypass it.
Atoning sacrifice. And
Yeah.
whenever it translates hilasmos, it translates it as atoning sacrifice instead of propitiation or expiation, which I kind of like, because then you don't have to get bogged down in, well, which word was it? It's still an atoning sacrifice
Like
either way.
nobody would know if you said those words in some other context anyway. In English, nobody would know what they meant.
That's true. Nobody walks around talking about expiation or propitiation. It's like, hey, Caleb, how's your expiation going? And you'd be like, whoa, that's personal.
Yeah, I didn't tell you about my medical procedure.
Okay, so another really neat thing about this is that the entire community shared in this atonement. Okay, so the Day of Atonement was not just for the priest, not just for one person, but the entire community. And in the case of Israel, they are a nation of their own, kind of. And if you think about that for us today, imagine that the entire country could just move past something, right? And just put it behind us. I mean, to think of the value of that, not just for our country, but any particular country. Think of like slavery. Okay, let's just expiate that. Let's okay, that was really terrible, and I think we did that with a big giant war. And a lot of people died.
Well, we sacrificed 700,000 Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And we had to do that to purge that from our national psyche. And then like war atrocities. If you think of Germany, I mean, how in the world did Germany recover from what happened in World War II, or Japan? Mm-hmm. They both got past it. They both turned into booming economies and leaders in the world again. And nobody really even thinks about them that way, right?
Well, the answer was that we forgave them, and the Americans did. I mean, we just funneled billions of dollars into their economies and rebuilt them.
Well, but it's useful that, and that's why I was saying earlier that I think Western civilization has risen beyond the limits that any other civilization had ever reached, whether it was Europe at its height or the United States following Europe's sort of crash, is that we have that in our national psyche, that we understood the Old and the New Testament, and we offered that to other people, just like the priest offered that to the people, serving in the capacity that God ordained for him.
It would be, really healing for a country to be able to do that.
So one of the other things I had contemplated that our nation might need forgiveness for is use of atomic weapons.
Speaking of Japan.
Yeah, speaking of Japan. So we are the only country that's ever used one in a war situation, and so that's something that a lot of people struggle with. And again, you know, things happen in history; they happen for reasons. And uh, one of the great things about this system of atonement that you can do for any problem that you have between you and God or between you and other people is we have to have the ability to recover from these things or relationship can't continue. And so regardless of what those mistakes may have been either at an individual or national level, um, this system that was promoted by the book of Leviticus and this concept of the Day of Atonement is the pinnacle, I think, of the system. Is the whole nation should be able to you know acknowledge a problem and say we can't, this problem can't continue, or we won't continue to be a community. And so we're, regardless of what it was, regardless of how bad or stupid it was, we have to get rid of it. And that's what the Day of Atonement lets you do, so you can move forward. So it provides a forward orientation, a future orientation, to your whole national psyche, your whole country. And but in the case of, say, the church, and to your whole community at church, or your whole community in the town you live in or the state you live in, we need to be able to have a future orientation. Or guess what? We don't have.
A future.
Yeah. So
So continuing in on with the Day of Atonement.
yeah,
Okay.
you want to move on. So let's look at what this kind of looked like in ancient Israel. How did they get atonement for the whole nation? And so you want to read the Leviticus 16:20 through 22?
When Aaron has finished making atonement for the most holy place, the tent of meeting, and the altar, he shall bring forward the live goat. He is to lay both hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the wickedness and rebellion of the Israelites, all their sins, and put them on the goat's head. He shall send the goat away into the wilderness in the care of someone appointed for the task. The goat will carry on itself all their sins to a remote place, and the man shall release it in the wilderness.
Okay, so that's interesting.
Yeah, that'd be a cool job. Go lose this goat.
So the very visual, it's a very visual thing, and a lot of people like visual things.
Yeah.
So what would happen there? It's like, look, we're putting everything on this this
We
goat.
have that laying on of hands again.
Yeah.
happening.
The transference of all of this over onto this animal, and then release the animal, and it's out of our community. It's gone.
Mhm.
Now, obviously, we don't have to do these things anymore the way they're described here, but
Right.
conceptually, we still need this. We still need this today.
Yeah.
We have to have a way of doing
I mean,
this.
you even wonder why they need this, because they already killed one goat for their sins. So I think you're right. God wanted this kind of for the psychological effect that it
So
would have.
so what is that? So okay, that's a great point. So
Banish your sins out into the middle of nowhere.
well, there's two of them, right? There's like you said. So there's the one that gets slaughtered and takes the sin that way, right? And then there's another one that's allowed to live.
Yeah, that's
And
true.
I think that's the whole point of it, right? Is like, okay, there's always death for sin. There always has to be blood, and that's what was going on at the temple all the time with this substitutionary sacrifice of these animals, which is great because it lets us move forward in our lives. But then in this case, it's a very visual thing, is like one of these animals has to die, but the hopeful part of it is one of them is being released.
Yeah, we'll call that one Barabbas.
That's an advanced topic for the New Testament, with Barabbas as the prisoner that was released
Yeah,
instead of Jesus in the New Testament. But there is certainly a parallel there.
yeah. That's an Easter egg, you might say.
All right. So
Sorry.
that was
It's Maundy Thursday.
that.
That's we're doing this.
Yes. So that was the sin offering, and now we have the burnt offering. So you might say, well, what's the difference? Well, if you read very carefully in the text, you'll see the burnt offering is completely burned and consumed, and none of the meat is eaten. Where one of the features of the sacrificial system was that um, there were portions of the meat that were burned up, but most of it was eaten by people, and including the priests. And
The part that was burned up was meant to be as a dedication to God, right?
yeah, as a
Yeah.
pleasing a sacrifice and aroma and all that, and the fat portions and things that were from the sin offering were offered. We're not going to get into the fellowship offerings in this session, but I think they're a key to understanding some of Jesus' teachings, especially some of his interactions with Pharisees and some of his parables and things, and the way he treats um, the outcasts of society and so on, are related to how the fellowship offerings were being handled in the first century, in the time of Christ. But we'll talk about that in another session. But in this case, so we had the sin offering, and that did away with the sin and atoned for the sin. And then you have the burnt offering, which is also a form of atonement. But what it is, and we talked about how um, there's a forward orientation, a future orientation to this. So let's read Leviticus 16:23 through 25. It says, "Then Aaron is um, is to go into the tent of meeting and take off the linen garments he put on before he entered the most holy place, and he's to leave them there." So it's a break. It's a break between the sin offering and what's about to happen. "He shall bathe himself with water in the sanctuary area and put on his regular garments. Then he shall come out and sacrifice the burnt offering for himself and the burnt offering for the people, to make atonement for himself and for the people. He shall also burn the fat of the sin offering on the altar." So he saved part of the sin offering to go on top of the burnt offering. Now, the important thing to notice in this is that in a burnt offering, the entire all the meat was burned up and not consumed by anyone. So the whole thing is given to God in the fire. And that signifies our total devotion to God, a total offering of ourselves, total commitment. We're all in. And when you say you're all in, right, there's a forward orientation to that idea,
yeah.
right? So
no going back.
yeah, the sin. Yes, right. That's right. Sin offering was about, I screwed up. There was a problem. It cost me something. It cost all of us something. Because when you give up something of yours, you're bringing the whole community pays for that in a way. Just like if a business fails in your community, it hurts the whole community. Well, so it hurts everybody, but we put it behind us. We're moving past. Now there's this idea of, okay, now I'm going to give the burnt offering, and I'm all in. I'm going no going back, like you said. It's all forward looking, and now we've restored the relationship. I'm back in. I'm fully into this relationship.
Yeah.
Or covenant.
Yeah, I like that. So we've seen how the high priest's role, all the priests could help you with the regular offerings, but the high priest's role especially is to help do away with the sins of the entire community, to atone for the whole nation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we saw that with the past sins being wiped away or expiated, as I talked about,
Yeah.
and totally gone. And then this commitment to the future that's established through the burnt offering, So here's our big Old Testament takeaway. You want to roll it out?
Yeah. God provides atonement so we can move forward.
That's right. And that's why I think Leviticus is the high watermark of the Old Testament, because
it's all downhill from here.
No, because that is a concept that sets the Old Testament covenant apart. That God is on your side, that he wants to help you get rid of your weaknesses, your flaws, and he wants you to be the best you can be, and he wants you to be able to be that for the rest of your life. And so that whole idea that you just said in simple
To have
terms.
life abundantly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we've talked about that in previous episodes. So this provides us with, on an individual level, right? It provides us a way through the sacrifices to get rid of our own sins. And not only that, but, it's very public. Like this is, bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting. We said that was, well, they have to face God and know that he's not condemning them anymore. But also everybody in the community, sees that you've gone and sacrificed, this to atone for your sin. And so if God can forgive them, right, I should forgive them. So there's a sense in which that heals within the community. And then we saw that there was a community or a national level with the high priest that we're all forgiven. So let's all move forward unencumbered by the past together. And so I just think it's the genius of the Old Testament.
Yeah. What's our takeaway from Leviticus? That it's God the genius or the God of atonement?
God, he's both, but God provides atonement so we can move forward. That's our Old Testament takeaway. Now, it's time to move to the New Testament. Okay, so we try to be true to our.
That's what I've been waiting for.
True to our model. We want to deal with the Old Testament as the Old Testament and figure out what it meant. And I hope that this has helped you understand the purpose of the sacrificial system, which is kind of strange to people.
Yeah.
But I think it's really, really in concept the genius of the Old Testament. So now let's
Hopefully
look at.
you've made it through Leviticus. You've already done more than most people do on their Bible read through.
But remember, the title of our series is "Who is Jesus Christ and Why Do I Need Him?" And we saw in earlier episodes in Hebrews 1, verses 1 through 3, for instance, it says that Jesus is the exact representation of God. We will see in Christ everything that we see in God in the Old Testament. So let's look and see, when does the New Testament refer to Jesus as a high priest?
Basically nonstop for the entire book of Hebrews.
Yeah. Well, that's the only book in the New Testament that calls him the high priest.
But it makes up for the other ones.
But the concepts of his actions are, and we've alluded to some of them earlier, are throughout the New Testament, where we see Jesus working or being presented to us in the manner of a high priest.
There are other allusions. I think it only just struck me earlier, like being baptized by John the Baptist.
Yes,
I think that's one of the reasons why he tells them that's what they need to do.
Mm-hmm. It's proper. So in Hebrews, let's look to see some typical places where it refers to Jesus as high priest. And in chapter 2, verse 17, it says, "For this reason, he had to be made like them," as referring to Christ being made like a human, like us, or like the high priests, the human high priests. So for this reason, he had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people, because he himself suffered when he was tempted. He is able to help those who are being tempted.
That's a hugely important verse right there. I mean, the major heresies, major mistakes you can make, pretty much almost all revolve around the nature of Christ. I mean, the vast majority of them historically. That verse right there is a great verse to look at, or I guess we have two verses there, but especially verse 17. That's a great verse to look at for the humanity of Christ. Some false teachers, some historical heresies have tried to separate the humanity from Christ because they think it's taking away from God. But this is what Jesus wanted to do. That's what God wanted to do for us, was to become our become a human, to become our high priest. Because that way he could make atonement for the sins of the people. Because uh, if he's not human like we are, then he's not able to represent us.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about it in the Old Testament, but the high priest risked his life. Any priest was risking their life for his fellow Jews by his service in the tabernacle. There were cases even of the sons of Aaron, two of Aaron's sons,
Mm.
who were struck dead because they brought foreign incense outside of God's instructions into the
Yeah,
temple. Um,
we didn't even talk about when once a year the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies. We didn't.
well, we didn't read it in that sense,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
that's what the Day of Atonement was.
Yeah, when he would
Yeah.
have to enter the Holy of Holies, because the tabernacle and then the temple after were set up with layers to them.
Yes.
And like the common people could only come, into the outer levels, and then the priests further in, and then in the Holy of Holies where the ark was and the presence of God was, only the high priest could go, and only once a year.
It talks about him going in there and he burns some incense to make some smoke to cover the mercy seat on the ark so that God, so he won't
He
look
can't see
directly
God.
at it,
Yeah, okay.
but it does talk about him going in there. We just didn't read that part. So the high priest, he would risk his life, and the priest in general, by service in their, in proximity to God. And like Caleb mentioned, if you aren't acting justly and holy before God and doing things carelessly, then that would be a risk of loss of your life. But
And it also would disqualify you as a representative of between God and the people.
why would a priest do that? Why would he do that for his fellow Jews?
Out of love, hopefully.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, why else would
Or I
anyone
suppose a human priest might have done it out of fear of the Lord, or
why would anyone risk their life for another person because they care about them? And I think it's a further example of how important the sacrificial system was for the community, for the people, to be able to move past their sin, and they're trying to accomplish that for them. And so now we're moving into the New Testament, and we're seeing Jesus described as the high priest, and I mean Jesus gave his life for us, and why would he do that?
yeah, because he loved us.
Yeah, same reason,
Yeah.
right? I mean, he knows there's something we need, just like these priests know the people need this, and they have to have it. They can't go on without it. Jesus knows we needed this, and so he comes and dies for us, and we're gonna
Mm.
talk more about that. So that's one of the reasons I think that it talks about his humanity, because he has been like us,
Mm.
and he knows what it's like to be human. He
Personally,
knows, hmm?
personally,
Yeah, personally,
relationally.
yeah, and he knows the difficulty that we face, and so you can be sure that he has your best interests at heart because he's been there. He's been tempted in every way, but never failed. So let's read Hebrews 4:14 through 16.
Uh, Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weakness, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need.
Yeah, so Jesus is this perfect high priest, it says, so we can trust the efficacy of his atonement, right? His atonement is going to have the proper, effect.
Mhm. Yeah, and as far as the confidence, I was thinking about that earlier. When you were talking about, we read how the people were afraid of the mountain, and wanted Moses to mediate between them and God, and you were saying, that God wanted them to come to him, and then also with the tabernacle that he wants them to come present the sacrifice at the entrance to the tabernacle.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we can confidently, approach God and know that He's going to accept us.
Yeah, absolutely. And that we have that confidence because we have our high priest is Jesus. So another interesting thing that the book of Hebrews talks about is how Jesus' sacrifice is unlike the high priest's sacrifice, the Day of Atonement, in the sense that the Day of Atonement was an annual day that occurred over and over and over again. And so here's how the book of Hebrews describes it in Hebrews chapter 7, 23 through chapter 8, verse 2. It says, "Now there have been many of those priests," speaking of the high priests, the human high priests, "since death prevented them from continuing in office. But because Jesus lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood. Therefore, he is able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. Such a high priest truly meets our need, one who is holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, exalted above the heavens. Unlike the other high priests, he does not need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins and then for the sins of the people. He sacrificed for their sins once for all when he offered himself. For the law appoints as high priests men in all their weakness. But the oath which came after the law appointed the Son who has been made perfect forever." Now, the main point of what we are saying is this: we do have such a high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, and who serves in the sanctuary, the true tabernacle set up by the Lord, not by a mere human being. Well, there's a lot in there.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So look at all the problems Jesus overcomes, because in that it says human priests are weak, right?
Yeah.
And so look at some of the things, like what are some of the things in there that you saw that he overcomes?
Well, we talked about how the priest first had to present a sacrifice on behalf of himself and his family, right, to be made clean.
Mm-hmm.
And this passage is why I wanted to point out it's God making him clean, right? It's not that he has the power to cleanse himself of sin. But Jesus didn't have to do that, because he already was sinless, and so he presents himself. I mean, he is both sacrifice and high priest, for us. But
Mm-hmm.
he presents himself as a holy and perfect high priest. And unlike the old priests who obviously would keep dying and a new one would have to take over, his priesthood will never end. So he's the perfect high priest, period, for all time. And because he's perfect, he can't fail. He won't ever fall short. You brought up some examples of priests not following God's instructions and being struck down for it. And because he's both perfect priest and perfect sacrifice, the sacrifice is sufficient for all, not merely for 1 year, or for just the nation of Israel or one person. It's for all people, all time.
Yeah. Yeah. And earlier when you were saying he was holy and blameless and pure, I mean, the impact or the meaning of that would be that his offering will be accepted, right? There's not going to be some catch-22 or problem with the offering. Because of his holiness, his blamelessness, and his purity. The other thing I think is kind of cool is where he makes atonement in this. It talks about how he's not making his atonement in the tabernacle down here on earth. He's making it in the heavenly tabernacle in heaven itself. And there's no higher place than that. So there's this atonement is the highest atonement,
Mm-hmm.
and there's no sin that it can't atone for.
That's why there's no need for tabernacle or temple anymore.
Correct. Yeah. And so it also says he sits at the right hand of the Father. And there's no more powerful place than that. So the power of your atonement is more powerful than anything in all creation. So anyway,
Yeah,
just to
I thought it was cool
uh,
that at the end of that passage there, where, um, and just to think of Jesus, he talks about, "I'm going to prepare a place for you," but it's also cool to think of him up there, performing the role of high priest on our behalf.
mhm. Yeah, you see some of those passages in Revelation that are so difficult to visualize, but some of them talk about I saw him as a lamb that was slain,
Yeah,
in heaven, and uh, but I
there's an
think,
altar in heaven as well.
but that as as un I don't know,
Unfamiliar.
yeah, we're unchristlike as it almost kind of like I don't know. You picture Jesus as a guy that commanded the room,
Yeah,
when he walked around and he made the best of all the people around him who tried to trick him. It's like render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. When they tried to trick him with tax monies and things, little controversies that they tried to. He always seemed like he was on the top of his game, but then to see him as a slain animal,
yeah.
But that was where he always knew
Well,
he was headed.
he's alive though. A slain lamb, but the slain lamb is doing things in Revelation.
Yeah,
It's kind of
it
like
is.
the burning bush that burns but is not burned up.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. It's interesting.
I know.
It's a, huh? Oh yeah, you're right. Okay, well, remember we talked about atonement, but anyway, now so let's get back to this forward orientation because there's another passage here in Hebrews that's interesting. Um, it says, and I don't think this one talks about him being high priest, but it's still talking about the agency he has in that role. In Hebrews 9:11 through 14, it says, "But when Christ came as high priest," oh,
Yeah,
I guess it
I was
does.
looking right at it.
As high priest of the good things that are now already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not made with human hands. That is to say, it's not a part of this creation. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean sanctify them so they are outwardly clean. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God? And I love the forward orientation again of this verse, which we learned in the Old Testament, but we see amplified in the New, that the activity of our high priest cleanses our consciences from the acts that lead to death so that we may serve the living God.
Yeah,
So this that forward, like don't
yeah,
it's
true.
like the Saving Private Ryan. It's like the guy's laying there dying after he goes in and
I
tells
haven't
him you
seen the
get to
movie in
go home.
forever.
He, he gets shot and killed, and he tells the guy, "Don't waste it. Like I just came in here and died so that you could go home. Now I'm never going home,
Yeah,
but don't waste the opportunity I just gave you." But it's kind of like this, like he died for us. We have perfect and full atonement, and our consciences are cleansed. We can start over, and we can serve God.
right. I was reminded, when it's talking about his blood being able to truly cleanse us, it reminded me of Ephesians 5, which I tend to think of Ephesians 5 as like the marriage chapter. I don't know if everyone else does, but right on the tail of talking about that, or I guess kind of in the middle, Paul says, "Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless." And I'm struck by the language of that verse. We talked earlier, or I brought up that, it's not Aaron making himself clean with the blood of a ram, it's God making him clean. And he's ordained the blood of the ram or the goat, whichever it was, to clean him. And I compare that to baptism, and that's exactly what happens there. Is Christ is washing us with baptism, and then in those three verses, um, I was struck by how much of the language was focused on talking about the church, the bride of Christ being made holy. He says, "Holy, cleansing her by the washing with water, to make her a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or blemish, but holy and blameless." I mean, I circled them all here. It's 9 times in 3 verses that one of those words comes up, 3 times per verse. So it made me think of that at the end of the which was that Hebrews 9, 11 through 14. That that's what Christ's blood is able to do for us, and that's because he is the perfect high priest.
Yeah, like we said earlier, even though Hebrews is the only place where it talks about him explicitly as the high priest, we see his agency as high priest
Yeah,
in very many other passages. So we have this forward orientation, and it's a gift from God. I call it the genius of the Old Testament. It's the genius in the New Testament too. But we need to embrace the forward orientation. God has, and Christ especially has sacrificed to great extent for us to have this opportunity, to have this kind of a forward orientation. So what are we going to do with it? So I wanted to read Hebrews 9:23 through 28, which is one of my favorite passages in the Bible. It says, "It was necessary then for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these sacrifices," speaking of the sacrifices in the tabernacle, "but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made with human hands that was only a copy of the true one. He entered heaven itself, now to appear for us in God's presence. Nor did he enter heaven to offer himself again and again the way the high priest enters the most holy place every year with blood that is not his own. Otherwise, Christ would have had to suffer many times since the creation of the world. But he has appeared once for all at the culmination of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself, just as people are destined to die once and after that to face judgment. So Christ was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many, and he will appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him."
Yeah. On the very first passage we read from Hebrews, in Hebrews 2, I made a point um to call out how that verse just absolutely makes clear the humanity of Christ. And not only in this passage, but the last several in Hebrews, we from Hebrews 7, 8, and 9 here that we've read, they're all making clear the deity of Christ. I mean, Hebrews 9, 11 through 14, no, sorry, in Hebrews 8, 1 and 2, it talks about how he is ascended to sit at the right hand of God and make atonement for us. And we're stressing here how he doesn't have to cleanse himself like a human high priest did because he's perfect. These are traits that, especially when you go back and look at the Old Testament context, it's clear that a human could never do this.
It's interesting. He does purify himself by his holy actions. So he doesn't need to be purified,
Right.
By these external washings.
Yeah. Because there's nothing on his behalf for him to make atonement for.
Yeah.
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 So I like that Hebrews, bookends all of these, like a dozen mentions of him as high priest with uh, a pretty solid argument for his humanity and his deity. I think that's important because only God could be a perfect high priest, but only a human high priest could represent humanity and take away their sins.
And in this last section here that we just read in Hebrews 9:23 through 28, it's like a perfect uh, parallel to the Day of Atonement. So everything you see in there, you see it with great amplification, but it's all the same things that we read in Leviticus. And it makes the point of saying it's not on earth, it's in heaven in verses 23 and 24. And then it says it's not again and again, like the Day of Atonement told you,
Yeah.
do this every year, but it's once for all in verses 25 and 26. And then it's not with the blood of animals, but it's with his own blood, it says in the same two verses. And then it's not to wipe away certain sins. But I love verse 26 says he's going to do away with sin.
Period.
Yeah, that's amazing.
All of it.
That's amazing. I mean, talk about an amplification of what was in the Day of Atonement in Leviticus. This is like wipe it completely out. Like, and we talked about expiation, like wiping away the sin, and this is like he's doing away with sin forever.
Mm-hmm.
And so this was again a community atonement for many people, it says in verse 28. And then I love the end of verse 28 because it's just like, forget about sin. And he is coming back, but he's not going to even deal with sin. He's coming back. He's coming back for the people who are in community with him, the people who are waiting for him.
Yeah,
and
that's what we ended the Exodus one with. Ties it in perfectly.
Yeah. So this is what we're supposed to be about. That's the forward orientation. We're supposed to be what sin is over. So stop breaking community over sin. Like, forget about the sins people commit against you. Give them the grace that God gives you. Forget about your own sins and let God take care of them, and commit yourself to moving forward and in a forward orientation and living for God, like we talked about a few verses back. And keep that forward orientation. And we can be a community of people completely unburdened from sin and with a forward looking orientation.
Yeah, I wanted to bring in a quote here from Christian author G.K. Chesterton. This is from his book "What Is Wrong with the World." He also famously, I think probably this is what gave him the idea for this book. He received an inquiry from a magazine asking him to write about what was wrong with the world, and he responded with a letter that said simply, "Dear sirs, I am, sincerely yours, G.K. Chesterton." But he's talking about in this quote, he's talking about he was very prescient. I mean, he saw a lot of what was coming down the pipeline because he wrote in the early 20th century. And he's writing here about progressivism and modernism, and where it's leading us, culturally and psychologically. He says the modern mind is forced towards the future by a certain sense of fatigue, not unmixed with terror, by which it regards the past. Futurity does not exist because it is still future. The future is a blank wall on which every man can write his name as large as he likes. The past I find already covered with illegible scribbles such as Plato, Isaiah, Shakespeare, Michelangelo, Napoleon. I can make the future as narrow as myself. Men invent new ideals because they dare not attempt old ideals. They look forward with enthusiasm because they are afraid to look back. All the men of history who have really done anything with the future have had their eyes fixed on the past. So the Reformation looked back on the Bible and Bible times, the Protestant Reformation, he means. He brings up several examples there, but that's one movement that's obviously very pertinent to what we're talking about here. So he says, When he, meaning mankind, when he tries to think about the future itself, his mind diminishes to a pinpoint. Tomorrow is the Gorgon or the Medusa. A man must only see it mirrored in the shining shield of yesterday. If he sees it directly, he is turned to stone. Now that would seem at first like a contradiction to everything we've said, right? We're talking about moving past, being able to move on and be forward looking, forward oriented. It's not a contradiction though, because moving past something is not the same as forgetting all about it or ignoring it. When I was 6 or 7, we moved away from the first house that you and mom bought, but I still have, fond memories of playing there. I'm sure you and mom have fond memories of it. I know you liked living right next to the woods there. Well, I remember walking with you in the woods and having bird feeders there. And then all the birds would just flock out of the woods. We have a lot of fond memories. Um, but without looking back, we wouldn't be looking at Leviticus. We wouldn't be looking at Hebrews. We wouldn't be able to appreciate what Christ has done for us. Progress means accepting the past and then building on it. We start from where we are now, and this is why I wanted to bring this quote up, because this is a problem with our culture's mentality today. Is they think of progress as we need to basically reject our whole past and then somehow move forward to a better future. But that doesn't make any sense, because progress is starting from where you are, building on that foundation, and then being able to build up from there. But because our culture has lost its religion, has lost its ability to deal with guilt, to deal with sin, their only option then is to try to go back. Progressivism is actually regressivism. They're trying to go back. They're trying to leapfrog over Christ, leapfrog over Leviticus, and get back before all the sin and before all the guilt, and try to build a whole new society from scratch. But there's a much simpler solution, which is the forgiveness that Christ offers, because he's offered a perfect atonement that can forgive all of our sins individually and as a culture. And so we don't, what Chesterton's talking about when he says that all the men who did anything with the future had their eyes fixed on the past. He's saying those were men who could accept and forgive the sins of the past, and then still bear to look at it. They weren't crippled by the atrocities of it. And now our culture looks at, the slavery in our past, the atomic bomb, like you brought up earlier, racism and misogyny. All of those things exist. All of those things have been done. But if you've been forgiven, like you said, if I see God forgive you, I can forgive you. So if we've been forgiven, then we can forgive others, we can forgive ourselves and our society, and then be able to look to the future.
That's a pretty deep way of thinking about it. We said that if you saw our earlier episode on the word Bereshit, the first word in the Bible, we said that the reason God opens the Bible with that word is to say, I was there in the beginning. I've been here since the beginning. And we talked a lot about this concept in that session. So if anybody wants to watch that episode, it's episode 0. It's one of our bonus episodes before we started this series. But the idea is that, we live on the shoulders of the past, but we don't need to be buried by the sins of the past or mired in them, like you're saying. So yeah, that's what we're trying to say. That's what Leviticus is trying to say too. It's, you don't have to jettison everything, including your own life, because you can't get past your sin.
Yeah.
Get past it and move on.
Because dealing with your past as an individual or as a country, there are going to be sins, and bad things there. So you only can you could affirm them, say, oh no, they were good, and I'll just accept it all, or you can, be overwhelmed by them, or you can have them forgiven and be able to still accept the good things and learn from the mistakes and the good things, and be able to move on and build, forward.
Yeah, that's a valuable insight. So we just got done talking about the Old and the New Testament, and as has been the case several times our New Testament takeaway is pretty similar to the Old Testament takeaway with a little adaptation. So the New Testament takeaway is Jesus has done away with sin so we can move forward to life. So a little bit of an amplification of the Old Testament takeaway. And, we need to claim this for ourselves individually. And we need to claim this together as a community, I think. And we need to claim it nationally as a country. Get back to this way of thinking that we can move beyond our mistakes, because we all make mistakes. We're hypersensitive to these mistakes now, and we're not letting anybody get past their mistakes. We're going back to high school, and we're finding things people did and say, well, then you can't.
That's true. I hadn't thought of
can't
that.
serve, in our country because of something you did in high school.
Yeah, just go on Twitter. They find something,
Yeah.
there's something on there every day, some public official or celebrity. They find something they said in 1980 or
when people
whatever.
apply for a job, people go to their Facebook page and troll through all the stuff they have posted there and say, oh, look, they said something I don't agree with. So,
it's almost, that quote talked about being crippled by looking at the future. But I mean, if you can't move on from sin, if there's no forgiveness, then you're also crippled by looking at the past.
Yeah. Our prayer is that you'll be able to embrace the forward orientation of God at all levels, whether it's individual, community, national, that we will all together be able to embrace this kind of orientation once again, because we've had it in the past. And like I posited earlier, I believe that Western civilization benefited from this, was able to move forward in ways that no other civilization had, whether it was going to the moon or any of the other amazing achievements that we've had in Western civilization, both sociologically and technologically, politically. There's been so many amazing accomplishments we've made that were based on the Judeo-Christian principles, including this one that allowed us to move forward on the shoulders of the past, like Caleb mentioned, so without being mired by it. So that's our prayer for you, that you'll be able to find a forward orientation for your life.
We also pray, because it happens to be the week of Easter right now as we're recording, whether it's Easter or not when you're watching, we thank God for the resurrection, and we hope that you'll take a moment to remember it and think about what that means for us.
Yeah,
that's the ultimate act that our high priest came to perform.
That's true. So he's Caleb and I'm Timothy. Thank you for listening to Bible discussions on Biblocus, where the Bible intersects with your life. Please consider subscribing to our channel to help support our efforts. All scripture quotations, unless otherwise indicated, are taken from the Holy Bible, New International Version, NIV, copyright by Biblica Inc., used by permission of Zondervan, all rights reserved. This program is copyright 2024 by Timothy Klingerman. God bless all of you.